There are two kinds of history. Official history, the kind which is taught in schools. Then there's secret history, a scandalous kind of history which explains how things really happened. This is the story of Australia's secret history. ASIO is Australia's leading intelligence agency, set up to identify spies and subversives who threaten the state from within. It has opened files on hundreds of thousands of citizens, creating a unique history of dissent. These files are dark biographies in which all suspects are guilty. Our series tells a few of the stories from the previously secret intelligence files of these persons of interest.
Secret ASIO minute paper, 5'10", solid build, boyish appearance. Roger Milliss. He is one of the leading distributors of communist propaganda at Sydney University. Definite leadership ability.
ASIO became interested in me because I was the son of Bruce Millis, whom they were already following.
Bruce Millis, Katoomba Party member. Definitely red. He is frustrated but dangerous in that he is the complete Marxist-Leninist.
The story of Roger and Bruce Milliss is one of idealism and self-destruction, a dilemma the Communist Party embodied perfectly. Regarded as subversive and possibly KGB spies, they were watched and their lives recorded in detail in some of the earliest files opened by the new intelligence agency, ASIO. And slowly, these files changed their lives. Many young men returned from the Second World War disillusioned with the system and hoping that communism offered an alternative. The Communist Party was more popular than it had ever been, but the US had the atomic bomb, and to maintain a balance, the Soviet Union needed the secret.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
It was a very, very tense time, what was called the Cold War. It was a generation or a couple of generations that had lived through the most terrible time in history. On the one hand, people's idealism was high, the hope to build a better world. On the other hand, people's fears of what might happen were high. And there was also, over everything, the possibility of the ultimate, which was nuclear war.
The Soviets' wartime spy network was now targeted at the West's nuclear secrets.
Will you be working at the embassy, Mr. Popov?
Yes, I will.
May I ask in what capacity?
As a second secretary.
Using foreign communists and sympathisers, bribery and blackmail, the Soviets hunted secrets of the bomb all over the world.
I believe your department has information on plans for the Polaris mixed fleet.
My boss had. I shouldn't have told you.
Of course not. But you have.
However, the Allies had a crucial advantage, one of the biggest secrets of the 20th century, Venona.
Venona was an intelligence operation where the West, the CIA, MI6 and so on, had broken into Soviet codes, and they could read Soviet intelligence documents. That is an incredibly difficult bit of cryptanalysis.
Venona's groupings of 4 numbers revealed the code names of Soviet spies around the world. And some of these spies were Australian, with code names like Tourist, Girlfriend, and Clod. But who were they? The Australian spy ring had to be eliminated. The British informed Prime Minister Chifley that Australia would be cut off from all Allied intelligence if he didn't establish an agency to identify the spies.
Furthermore, if anything happens to alert Popov...
ASIO was formed in March 1949. It was a pretty humble start. The staff then only numbered 4 other people, and I was the 5th. I was responsible in the early days for establishing a record system, and I can remember opening the first file.
ASIO's first job would be identifying the spies behind the code names.
And tourist, I think might have related to Jim Hill, but I'm not sure.
Members of the Foreign Affairs Department, or External Affairs Department as it was then called, were leaking material to a secret member of the Communist Party.
C is Claude, Walter Seddon Clayton. I think he was a full-time functionary of the Communist Party of Australia. What I'd read into this is that Clayton was in fact running this group of agents himself for the KGB.
Walter Clayton was giving the material to a Soviet embassy official.
FM, I think, was probably Makarov.
Who was then sending it by cable to Moscow.
So began a secret war that was to last for the next 40 years. ASIO soon identified most of the people supplying Clayton with information. And as many of them were either members or had close connections with the Communist Party of Australia, the party itself became the main target, and the party gave ASIO a vast supply of persons of interest.
My father and I were very close, exceptionally close. I was fascinated as a kid by the tales he used to tell, his first glimmerings of political ideas. All those things were like a legend that I grew up with. He was a very devout Catholic and had joined the Labor Party when he was only 17. But as the Great Depression of the 1930s took place, he moved further and further left and finally in 1937 joined the Communist Party.
Bruce Millis. This man is the #1 open party member in the district. He is particularly active and very ambitious.
There's no denying that he devoured Marxism in much the same way as he had previously devoured Christianity. So to that extent, he could be described, I suppose, as a zealous person.
Bruce Millis was an enigma, a prosperous businessman, a communist, and campaign director for Labor Prime Minister Ben Chifley.
At the end of World War II, the Communist Party had an enormous influence in Australian society. It had 20,000 plus members. It controlled either directly or indirectly around about half of the trade unions in Australia. It had huge influence amongst scientific and technical workers. Its principal aim was to overthrow the entire established order, a revolution in which the Communist Party would be the leading force.
The only way to know what's happening in the Communist Party of Australia is by the recruitment of people that we could call agents, of course, to join that organisation and provide information on what that particular part of the Communist Party was doing.
Unlike ASIO officers who were full-time employees, ASIO agents were typically young men who were generally unpaid volunteers. ASIO aimed to have one agent in every Communist Party branch. They called this Operation Sparrow.
I didn't even know what communism was about and all that sort of stuff, you know. I was politically naive at the time, you know, and I went to the YMCA, I played footy, had a lot of mates, and I was an ASIO agent for 23 years. I was sitting in my car in High Street. A man of about 55 came over to the car and knocked on the window and said, "Are you Phil Geary?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm an ASIO officer. Can I sit in and explain why I'm here?"
You would be appealing to people's willingness to do something to serve their country in this way. So the motivation, I think, generally would be one of loyalty to our country.
A lot of the Cold War was fought in secret. The government set up ASIO as a secret organisation. At the same time, the Communist Party also had a clandestine side to it, and it had some members who were actually in the Labor Party.
My father was a member of the Communist Party while still retaining his membership of the Labor Party. In other words, He was what they call a double card holder. It would have been Communist Party policy to try and swing the Labour Party left to socialism. He became very close to Chifley, who was our local member in Macquarie, and he became Chifley's campaign director in 3 elections. Chifley was selling off factories which had been government-owned to private enterprise. My father attacked Chifley to his face as an apologist for the capitalist system.
There was criticism by him of Prime Minister Chifley, whom he described as a stooge for capitalists.
But in those days, it was one of the greatest insults you could throw against a Labour Party leader, and so my father was peremptorily expelled. A few months later, he announced that he had joined the Communist Party, even though it was pretty wide knowledge that he'd joined 10 years earlier.
When Mao gained power in China, there was a sense of disaster. So he was a new menace from Asia, but this time a kind of red menace.
When the Soviets exploded their first nuclear bomb and signed a non-aggression pact with China, the fear of communism escalated.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party? Are you a member of the Communist Party?
The Communist Party is revolutionary, that it seeks to overthrow government by violence or fraud.
Menzies was able to develop a very powerful anti-communist theme and to tag the Communist Party in Australia not only as subversive, but as a 5th column for the Soviet Union.
It will be your chance on Saturday, ladies and gentlemen, to tell them exactly where they get off.
You have given us not only an enormous majority, but an enormous task.
In 1950, the new Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, appointed Colonel Charles Spies Director General of ASIO. Spry and Menzies were committed anti-communists who blurred the lines of impartiality between ASIO and the government to the mutual benefit of both.
The communists in Australia were always yellow. They have one loyalty only, and that is to the Soviet Union.
Used to have schoolyard arguments. I remember I had to run the gauntlet of the kids leaning out the windows saying, "Go back to Moscow, Millis, you commo spy." But I could take that on my chest, I didn't bother about it. So I was sort of politically precocious, and I followed very proudly in my father's footsteps. But it did affect my mother very badly. Her old family friends used to cut her dead in the street. It was very difficult for her. Very difficult for her. As far as my father was concerned, that ostracism contributed to his wanting to leave the mountains. I, like my brother, just couldn't wait to get down to the big smoke. I was at university, labouring through an arts degree, which must have been one of the worst degrees at Sydney University ever awarded anyone.
Roger Milliss first came to ASIO's notice in August 1953 when he wrote an article in the Sydney University newspaper condemning the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in the US on charges of passing atomic secrets to the Russians. His position in the University Labour Club, stance against conscription, and involvement in a demonstration and riot to have a footbridge built outside the university were also noted.
There were about 3,000 students, I would say, in this area here, the biggest demonstration that Sydney University had seen. There was a group of overheated engineers gathered there, and they just picked up the barricades and the rest of the crowd just followed them. So I was left here swinging from a lamppost while this extraordinary stream of students took over Parramatta Road completely. So that's when the police called in the riot squad and they just hoed into everyone left, right and centre. The demonstration got a fair amount of publicity, but it also attracted the attention of ASIO. Inquiries have revealed Millis R.W. is adversely recorded by Police Special Branch.
He is very talkative. He was once given the task of elaborating on a particular theme during the council meeting, but was eventually reprimanded for wandering off the point. Roger Milliss...
They had me right down to a T. May Day 1959. This would have been the Teachers' Federation contingent, I would say. There's Dennis Freeney over there. Very close friend of mine and associate. We all assumed that there could well have been an ASIO agent in either the University Labour Club or the Communist Party.
And I know that there were many agents like myself, and we were called sparrows simply because, as a sparrow, nobody seemed to notice little birds that fly around, so nobody noticed us, what we were doing. I went to 3 state conferences. They were frightful things, and you'd sit there listening to people talk, a whole load of rubbish. And after the meetings were over, I was debriefed very quickly. There'd be probably 100 to 200 photographs that I was to try and put a name to the face.
Francis Henry Hamill from Bass Hill. There's Sheehan again, acting as dog. This man is of no interest. Mavis June Robertson, who is very active in the Eureka Youth work. Ray Lewis appears to be giving this woman directions, and she is of no interest. The man with the cardigan and open neck shirt is Mick Ewer. John Bernard Mundy on the left.
That's not me.
New South Wales.
No good looking bloke, but looks a bit like him, but he's getting better looking all the time. It could be me, yeah.
John Bernard Mundy on the left, followed by George Bentley Atkins of the Sydney District Committee of the Communist Party.
I know they're being watched. I always had that suspicion because there were always shady characters around at meetings, particularly the night time. You'd see people lingering around where the meeting place was.
You were taught how to watch your target, how to move on different sides of the street, what you would need to do in the distance which you would need to keep from people. I don't say it was always successful.
Dogs, surveillance people. To spend your whole career basically sitting in cars watching people, you've got to have a very high boredom threshold. They're kept away from us, generalist intelligence officers, in case it was suspected that you'd gone bad and they wanted to do surveillance on their own people. I mean, that's an extension of the intelligence maxim. There's no such thing as a friendly intelligence agency. So basically, you don't trust anyone. No one.
I used to keep a little pocket diary, and I thought I was being very smart by writing down abbreviations of people's names opposite their phone numbers. And what did I do but lose it? I think I left it in a public phone box.
Suspected that the diary is the personal diary of Roger Milliss of 14 Chandos Street, Ashfield. Bob B., known as Robert James Brown, well known to headquarters. Cliff Gett, no record. Inquiries being made to identify.
Here's this new person appears unknown. Steps would be then taken to properly identify that person, and then it would result in a file being opened, so it doesn't require anything more than that.
The purpose of all this surveillance really was to underpin a system of vetting, so that if someone applied to become an Australian citizen or to join the army or particularly to take a government job, if that person had had contact with the Communist Party, ASIO would have at its fingertips when, where and to what degree. This was really one of the fundamental purposes of ASIO.
I knew many people who lost their jobs simply because as soon as they got a position with one company or another, the next week an ASIO man would come around and see the manager of the company and that particular person would get sacked.
To ASIO, nothing was what it seemed. The list of suspect front organisations ranged from mothers' clubs and film festivals to the Teachers' Federation, the Peace Movement, World Council of Churches and New Theatre.
Secret. Roger Milliss is about 24 years of age and has been teaching for 2 years. He is becoming a leading light in the New Theatre League. He is now well-dressed and well-spoken.
Acting had bedazzled me, I don't mind admitting it. I always wanted to play Hamlet, but unfortunately nobody offered me the part.
When I met Roger, he was a passionate, light-hearted man. He was so admired by members of Sydney New Theatre, a poet and a writer, and I was so flattered that he seemed interested in me.
But an ASIO agent inside New Theatre saw him differently.
Secret. This boy surely is bitter. Probably a high IQ, but couldn't possibly be as high as Roger considers it. Gives me the impression of a patient hanger-on, awaiting the inevitable revolution, so that he can assume his rightful status of the chief tax collector, chief of police, or what have you. I couldn't warm to him if he burst into flames.
Oh dear. When I read that at the age of 65, I can just remember saying to myself, ouch, ouch, ouch.
Finance was always a problem for the party, but Mao Zedong threw a lifeline when he agreed to trade with Australia through the Communist Party.
My father was approached to take part in commercial projects which the Communist Party was trying to get underway.
Bruce Millis's business experience would be invaluable to the party. He agreed to operate a number of businesses, and from then on he dropped out of sight. He never attended party meetings and was barely heard of again. This in itself attracted ASIO's attention. Bruce's timing was perfect. He was soon moving a third of all wool sold to communist countries, had a huge line of bank credit and provided much needed cash flow to the Communist Party.
Bruce Joseph Millis, February 1958. My unofficial view was that without any question, a great portion of the money received by Millis would go to the Communist Party of Australia.
We're dealing with a movement which is the greatest internal conspiracy of our time.
Whilst Menzies railed against the communist conspiracy, he had an economy in recession and the 1954 election approaching. The master politician was able to denounce communists and at the same time let Bruce Milliss sell wool to the Chinese.
I would like top priority given to a full investigation on Millis, both from B1 and B2 aspects.
One or two of you know him already. The rest of you, take a good look at these. He's to have the full treatment.
Well, I think of Bruce Millis as one of the 3 or 4 important undercover members of the party during the 40s and 50s. Clearly a real hardliner whose ideology was impenetrable and a real dogmatist, and someone who I think would have had a lot of secrets about what they were doing.
The main part of his business was exporting Australian wool to China, but he also became involved in importing anything and everything which could be sold in Australia.
Millis is the key man of New Dawn Films, a firm engaged in importing foreign films. He is answerable only to Mr. Kovalyev, commercial attaché of the Soviet embassy.
In the era before television, huge crowds flocked to the cinema where American films had extraordinary influence. Bruce Millis did his bit in this propaganda war.
собирается велика хмара, яка все знесе. Що ж по-твоєму? Що повернуть вверх ногами?
ASIO had a special section which essentially produced propaganda which they salted the media with. They had close relations with editors of newspapers, with even the owners of newspapers. They assisted in the production of various films, and so there was this clandestine propaganda war that ASIO was involved in.
Gutters will run red with blood.
With ASIO's support, the Australian government produced anti-communist propaganda, which Hoyts and 20th Century Fox distributed in the cinemas.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel.
Yeah, that was a rough... Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
And form a growing menace to the future of this country.
There's a massacre there.
Will that disturb you? It should. Because today, to achieve this victory,
ASIO was about to establish its credibility in the eyes of its more senior colleagues in MI5 and the CIA, and at the same time provide political ammunition to the Liberal Party for the imminent and closely fought election of 1954.
My dear Prime Minister, I acquainted you with the possibility that a member of the Soviet embassy, whom we believe to be the controlling intelligence officer, was thinking of defecting.
The Prime Minister announced that Vladimir Petrov, third secretary of the Russian embassy, has approached Australian security men and sought asylum. This had been granted.
What Petrov contributed were a series of documents that had been left in the Russian embassy safe by his predecessors, and these gave all sorts of very exciting clues to ASIO.
One of those documents contained the name Bruce Millis.
November 1954. Mr. and Mrs. Petrov have been questioned concerning their knowledge of a person named Bruce Millis, to whom reference...
It was a happy coincidence. Petrov could buy his freedom talking about KGB spy rings, and Prime Minister Menzies was facing a Cold War election. 3 weeks after Petrov's defection, Menzies rushed to announce a royal commission into espionage. With political tensions rising, connecting communist spies with the Labour opposition could win Menzies the election. Bruce Millis would be a damaging link between the two. In a subversive move, Director General Spry expressed his view to MI5 that if Labour won the election, the British should withhold all further intelligence from the new Australian government. In this atmosphere, Bruce Millis was duly called to appear before the Royal Commission.
They were very tense and turbulent times, and just to be mentioned before the Royal Commission on Espionage put the fear of God up some people. He was no political greenhorn, and he could see the implications of being called, and so consequently he was not going to give ASIO any more ammunition than he could help. Let me ask you, were you ever an undercover member of the Communist Party before you were expelled from the ALP? My father said no, and in that he lied. G.R. Richards, a very powerful man in ASIO, was determined to get my father arraigned on a charge of perjury. In my father's files, there are something like 50 pages prepared mainly by Richards trying to establish a case against my father.
But the government legal team refused to support ASIO's plan to charge Bruce Millis with perjury. Not used to being rebuffed, for Spry and Richards, the hunt now became personal. For the next 25 years, they took every opportunity to damage the careers of the Millis family.
Contact report. Bruce Millis, Reginald Dixon. Whilst entertaining a contact in the Martin Place bar of the Hotel Australia, I observed the above named. From 3:05 to 4:45 p.m, both men consumed 4 Scotch whiskies and water, plus 3 glasses of beer with no apparent ill effect. The drinks for both men were paid for from appreciable size rolls of banknotes. The identity of the blonde barmaid can be ascertained if required. She might be of future use.
The death of Stalin brought Nikita Khrushchev to power in the Soviet Union. He spoke less of war and more about peaceful coexistence between communism and capitalism, even denouncing Stalin as a criminal.
Hello, boys. What's new this morning? The text of Mr. Khrushchev's latest speech.
Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in his so-called secret speech had a tremendous effect on the communist movement. It shook it to its foundations.
Stalin acted not through persuasion, explanation, and patient cooperation with people, but by imposing his concepts and demanding absolute submission to his opinion.
Some denounced Khrushchev as an agent of capitalists. Others said, well, it's an attempt to shake off the terrible Stalinist period that was known but never admitted.
While Khrushchev now spoke of peaceful coexistence with the West, the Chinese demanded violent revolution.
When the Chinese and the Russian governments began to split, at first ASIO, along with the CIA, simply didn't believe this. They thought this was some kind of elaborate hoax. After a while, it became obvious that there was a very significant break occurring within the communist movement.
This film is a record of persons attending the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of Australia during Easter 1958. Approximately 200 delegates attended from all states, and about 90% have been identified.
That goes through every frame of this exposition, doesn't it?
Exposed on Friday the 4th of April, the opening day of the Congress. Laurie Ahrens in the light suit, with Friedrich Brown, with Edward Fowler Hill carrying papers under his arm.
The party in Australia split into two camps, either following the Russian line or the Chinese. Party Secretary Laurie Ahrens advocated peaceful change, while Central Committee member Ted Hill supported violent revolution. Ultimately, Hill would be expelled from the party and form the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, an offshoot and bitter opponent to the Communist Party.
I think that in China there is a striving towards communism in the true sense, yes.
New social forces have come into existence in our country which will enable us to achieve socialism without civil war.
People whom we call revisionists, headed in Australia by Mr. Ahrens, we don't regard as the left at all. We regard them as traitors to communism.
Well, my father started to follow the Hill line and take sides with the Chinese.
This violent split in world communism would have a dramatic effect on the Millis family, dividing father and son. Roger Milliss followed the Russian line of peaceful coexistence, whilst his father, Bruce, followed the more radical Chinese position. For many young Australians, rites of passage at that time included a trip overseas, and for Roger Milliss that meant to the Soviet Union.
I wanted to see the Soviet Union developed along the lines that I hoped it would take. And so any positive thing that I could find, I was quite prepared to report to Tribune.
Tribune was the Communist Party's newspaper in Australia. ASIO was a subscriber, and large amounts of its intelligence came from Tribune's pages.
Mr. Roger Milliss was married by the Australian ambassador in Moscow to Miss Susie Maria Wolfe. Wolfe holds a university degree. She is mixed up in women's affairs.
In Moscow, I worked on the African service of Radio Moscow. And I was a radio announcer and producer, and as well as being a disc jockey, which I loved, and late night, playing sexy music to people as they're going to sleep. But also I had my own program called The People Yes.
A new wave in Soviet films took place, and their films began winning prizes, Venice and Cannes. They could see that there was an increasing market for their films in the West. And so they started to sell their major films to the overseas arms of both Hoyts and Greater Union. And this had a devastating effect on my father.
Intercept report, evaluation B2, Soviet Trade Office. As regards Milliss, all business agreements with him are cancelled. You have to go and see Milliss and inform him about that. Don't be too hard on him.
Sovexport Films' betrayal, as he saw it, was proof that the Soviet Union was returning to capitalism.
This cemented Bruce's move to Maoism. In a letter to Roger, he wrote,
Mao Zedong has repeatedly pointed out Revolutionaries must despise the enemy, dare to struggle against him and dare to seize victory. To see his profound beliefs reduced to the catechism of the Little Red Book and the simplistics, the absolute ridiculous simplistics of Maoism just still leaves me, well, I can only say very, very upset.
Yes, I met Bruce on a few occasions. He was an extremist. When he went into the Marxist-Leninists, he became very bitter and very hostile to people who were his former comrades.
Secret. Consideration is being given to appointing Roger Milliss to the staff of the Tribune on his return to Australia. Some doubts are being expressed about his ideological standing, particularly because of the pro-Chinese position of his father, Bruce Joseph Milliss.
This split between the supporters of Mao and Khrushchev spread from the world stage to Bendigo.
Ted Hill, who was the head honcho of the Marxist-Leninist group, was coming to Bendigo, so the Communist Party wanted me to spy on that Marxist-Leninist bookstore. So I sat down about 3 blocks from the bookstore on this Sunday, and no one turned up, of course, and it seems ironical that one Communist Party had me spying on another Communist Party, and I was spying on them.
While Phil Geary gave ASIO information on other communists, the spy agency kept records on him and all their agents in documents called Source Management Records. These SMRs record ASIO's thoughts about its own agents. ASIO refuses to confirm or deny the existence of these files. Before returning to Australia, Roger and Susie Milliss were intent on seeing the winds of change in Africa, as colonial masters were thrown out and Marxists led their people to freedom. The Millisses broadcast, wrote and taught from Kenya across to Ghana, immersing themselves in revolution. ASIO kept track of them all the way. Their trip was interrupted by an offer of full-time work from Tribune in Sydney, which Roger accepted.
Travel control, 18th February 1966. Roger William Milliss. Watch will be kept in Sydney for their arrival. Deputy Director General Ron Richards.
I got back to Australia. The whole world had changed, the whole scene had changed.
I do wish you and Dame Patty a very happy and successful retirement. Yours, CCF Spry.
The era of Vietnam, the era of drugs, the era of music which I hated and still hate today. I can't abide it. I'll have to make that confession.
When we came back to Australia, we lived like in a little flat at the back of his parents' house, and it upset me terribly that this wonderful, gentle man, Bruce Milliss, that his son so argued with him so vehemently, because I knew there was such great love there.
The offices of Tribune were in the headquarters of the Communist Party, the most heavily watched building in Australia. All phone calls were recorded and comings and goings noted. Roger's life now became itemised in forensic detail, and Susie Milliss's attempts to get work at the ABC only heightened ASIO's suspicions.
Phone intercept. Susie Milliss contacted Roger Milliss and said she did not have much luck. She said the secretary, although very understanding, said there was little chance for women. Deputy Director General, New South Wales. In accordance with the Director General's approval to discuss important intelligence matters involving the ABC with Mr. Talbot Duckmanton, he was informed that Mrs. Milliss intended to seek employment with the ABC. Mrs. Milliss was not so employed.
I was applying for radio work and not getting it, and I felt so useless. I remember I used to sit on the back step, and I must have been really quite depressed.
Secret, B2 David Millis. Around 6 feet tall, a good-looking, well-spoken, likeable chap. High IQ, possible university background.
And now ASIO would
Accordingly,
change David Millis's life.
The Australia Council was set up and advertised for personnel, and one of the jobs was for senior assistant to the first head of the council. So my brother David applied.
ASIO file note. David Millis was the outstanding applicant, and the interviewing committee would need compelling reasons not to appoint him.
But he had to get a security check. And ASIO, of course, picked him up immediately.
Secret. It is considered that to allow David Ernest Millis access to classified matter would constitute a security risk. Accordingly, it has been recommended to the Public Service Board that he should not be appointed to any position permitting such access. CCF Spry, Director General of Security.
That was the end of any possibility that my brother had of getting a position with the council.
Secret. Intercept report. Susie Millis contacted Roger Milliss at the Communist Party of Australia premises and told him she would like to visit her parents in Melbourne as she was 7 weeks pregnant, and the doctor in Sydney would not do anything about it.
Although she had told him they were in debt, Susie remarked it would not be good staying at home because of Roger's mother. She said her mother would make the appointment for her, and she will now make a train booking. Roger remarked favourably on her parents and said he would swap your mother for my own mother. Ah, dear. I don't remember that. Yes, so we must have felt that Roger's mother would want a child. We were in no position then to have a child. As you can see, financially we're in debt, but I don't think our marriage was strong enough either. Isn't it terrible that somebody was listening to that phone conversation about something so personal, and listening to Roger's reaction and making that now still exists. Luckily his mother's dead and doesn't know. It is smutty, isn't it? Sort of smutty eavesdropping on people's private talks.
It's none of ASIO's business, and this is just another example of the filth of their material generally, as far as I'm concerned.
From the Communist Party of Australia premises, Roger Milliss contacted Mavis Robertson. Robertson said she had seen Susie Millis. When Millis asked if Susie had inquired about him and Robertson replied in the affirmative, he said this sounded encouraging. Robertson disagreed and said that Susie had apparently made up her mind to stay in Melbourne. I naturally reverted to my maiden name, Susie Wolfe, rather than Susie Millis, because I was now single again. During 1966-67, Millis failed to obtain employment until she secured a position in Melbourne under her maiden name of Wolfe. Secret. After 6 months of working as a typist with Radio Australia, I applied for a job with the education section of the ABC as a script assistant and got that. In the form where it said, "Are you married and where did you get married?" I naively filled in, I was married in Moscow. Of course, no idea that security would be showing any interest. Wolfe has an extensive record of activities in the New Theatre and Communist Party. It is recommended that a security clearance be withheld.
G.R. Richards went to see Talbot Duck Manton, the general manager of the ABC, linking her application to join the ABC as an announcer and producer and nothing more, linking that with a widespread communist conspiracy to white-ant the ABC.
The boss called me to his office and more or less told me my services were no longer required, which was such a shock. I found out since, and it was 31 years later that I found out by seeing my ASIO file, that it was because ASIO insisted I not work for the ABC. I wish I had known that at the time, because again I just felt I must be hopelessly incompetent.
The most upsetting thing in the files was that they traced my personal life right down to the nth degree. Relationships with women and things like that.
Secret. August 1968. Roger Milliss is separated from his wife Susie, who is now living in Melbourne. Milliss does not know of her whereabouts.
And in the end, the party folded here in Bendigo, the CPA, it was called, the Communist Party of Australia. And I thought, well, my job's finished now. But ASIO wasn't finished with me. They wanted me to join the Marxist-Leninist group.
So-called Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist, led by Edward Fowler Hill, Ted Hill, who had been a leading member of the CPA but expelled for his pro-Chinese stance back in 1963. Whenever Hill came to Sydney, he would invariably look up my father, because my father would have been a source of finance for the new organisation with Chairman Hill as the Antipodean Mao.
There would be no doubt that Millis is a Marxist-Leninist. The only doubt there could be is that the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist, are using him up for their own ends. Intercept report. Secret. From the Third World Bookshop, Bob Gould contacted Paddy George. According to Gould, the Maoists are to open a bookshop in the Mick Simmons building in George Street, and it was Bruce Millis who would be supplying the money.
Rog, Mao says the atom bomb is a paper tiger which the US reactionaries used to scare people. Pop, I can only say I'm utterly disgusted by the barrage of filth and absolute bullshit in Peking Review. Pop, how can you reconcile mass murder, torture and terror with communism? Rog, getting old. How time slips away. He and I had very violent arguments in which I went for his jugular, I must admit to my shame. Even though we're on the same side of the fence, politically. And he died believing that the Cultural Revolution in China was the greatest thing since sliced cheese, one might say, and that Mao Zedong was the leader of the world revolution, and he died a thoroughgoing Maoist.
Information obtained by B1 Victoria and Pastor B1 headquarters this morning indicates that Bruce Joseph Millis died in Sydney yesterday. Millis was considered a leader of the CPA-ML in Sydney and a possible financier of the party. Edward Fowler Hill and possibly other members, adherents of the CPA-ML, are expected to attend the funeral service.
Hill's arrival was watched at Sydney Airport by, it must have been 3 or 4 different people strategically placed round the airport. It almost reads like one of those BBC spy dramas.
Surveillance report. Edward Fowler Hill.
They followed his car, picked up another prominent Maoist, Bert Chandler, drove out to Rookwood Cemetery, where the funeral service took place. ASIO tried to photograph proceedings, but unfortunately, from their point of view, they just couldn't get a clear shot of it.
Surveillance report, 11th November 1970. Locations did not permit a full photographic operation. However, some photographs Outward message to Sydney from headquarters. Hill is to be placed under surveillance. Dixon said there were not many at the funeral. Chandler did not give a speech, but merely asked people to remain silent in memory of Millis. Headquarters have requested details of the disposal of Millis's estate. ASIO, Bruce Joseph Millis, deceased, Attached is a copy of a report outlining results of inquiries made at the probate office. Edward Fowler Hill, together with Millis's sons, David and Roger, the third share of the bequest is willed to Edward Fowler Hill personally, rather than the CPAML. There is no legal requirement.
They went right through the probate office. They got the details of my father's will and inserted that in his files. I got my files progressively from ASIO, and they totalled about 650 to 700 pages. It reached the extreme of a file saying Roger William Milliss, and then the following 2 pages would be completely blacked out.
Roger requested reconsideration of some of these deletions, and here are the words that were censored. Advice has been received from, and that Millis and his wife.
Here I am at the age of 75, drawing towards the end of my life and living only 10 kilometres away from where I was born. It's been a strange odyssey. Basically the story of a father and son who shared the same ideals and values and yet unfortunately argued too long and too vehemently about them. I still believe in those ideals and principles, and I still hope that they will come about. We anchored in coffee bars and talked of the working class. We harboured in libraries and longed for the storm blasts. The past is dead. How much of what we were are we today?
To be Quasimodo stream. Shall I beg the ring, must please find another?